Now I'd like to introduce our panel in the order in which they'll be speaking. We'll have them go for about 10 or 12 minutes each, and then we'll get to the general discussion. If they go longer than their 10 or 12 minutes, about 15 minutes, I become agitated. At 20 minutes, I become violent. So I assume that they're going to stay to their time. On the far left, we have Kevin Finneran. Kevin is the editor-in-chief of Issues in Science and Technology, the sort of journal of science and technology policy established and published by the National Academies. And Kevin at the National Academies is also the is it executive director or director of the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy. Those are two full-time hats that Kevin manages to switch on and off with great aplomb. He'll be followed. Actually, this is not in the order. The order of the program is not the order of the folks on there, but that's okay. We'll go to Ellen Ficklin, who is an editor at Health Affairs for the Narrative Matters section, and Ellen told me that she's looking forward in the not too distant future to heading off on a freelance career as well, and working on some freelance projects, including a book. Mike Rosenwald from the Washington Post. And last but not least, the good kid and the principal investigator of the Fit to Write, the published my colleague at Arizona State University. Lee is a writer-in-residence at the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, and a professor in the Hugh Downs School of Communication. So with that, I'll invite Kevin to come on up, and we'll be talking about creative nonfiction science policy, transforming ideas into story. Kevin.
Okay, I'm going to start with show and tell. I'm going to pass around some copies of issues. You can look at I use my card to mark articles that were results of the first edition of the Think to Write to Publish. 5 of the teams that were part of that exercise wrote articles that we eventually published in Issues in Science and Technology. And I think it's interesting to see the whole magazine so that you understand where Issues is coming from. Issues is really the old school style of publication. This is a science policy magazine from the oldest, most august, second oldest actually, AAAS is older, second oldest, most august science institution in the country. And these are people that think analysis, data, facts, charts, graphs, that's how people think, that's how you convince people, that's how we talk to one another. And most of our articles reflect that. Even the articles, we'll publish articles by members of Congress or corporate CEOs, but all in this format, pretty much like congressional testimony, analytic, factual. And so we decided, when I participated the last time in the Think to Write to Publish, that we knew that this was dull, and we knew that we were limiting ourselves to the audience. I mean, Issues has a very specialized audience. I mean, they're, 85% of our readers have graduate degrees. They have a ridiculous amount of money. They have senior management positions in universities and corporations and in government. But, that's a handful of people. They're influential, they're important people. But Issues was really created to extend the science and technology policy discussion outside of the usual suspects. We thought that these are issues that are of tremendous importance to people throughout the society, and the issues that we deal with are not determined strictly by the science and technology component. They're ethical components, they're social, cultural components, economic components. And to make these decisions, we think that it's important for those people that have expertise to interact with a much larger public. So, of course, we started publishing deadening analytic articles, which they wouldn't read. So, basically with the approach of we'll just beat them over the head until they agree with us. And that works some of the time. But it's much more effective to actually write something that people are interested in, they get engaged in, and to reach people with stories that they want to tell. Because all of these issues are connected to everyday events in life, and there are human stories that go with them. So we said, all right, we'll experiment. So we worked with many of the teams to do this. And one of the things we found out is, as great as an idea as it is, it's really, really hard to do. Partially because many of the people who do this type of work are, analytic, left brain type of people. And often they've spent their careers, they've gotten to where they are by doing that type of thinking, by providing all the evidence you could possibly accumulate, just piling it all up, thinking the more you've got, the more you can squeeze in there, the more numbers you've got, the more compelling it is. Well, that's true to 3 or 4 people, but it's not true to many of the people, including policymakers, which is one of the audiences that we most want to reach. And although, policymakers are educated, they're all lawyers, so we know they went to school and to college and then afterwards. But typically they do not think in the same types of, same terms and in the same ways that we do, because if they did, they wouldn't get elected. Because they have to talk to ordinary people and their ordinary voices about day-to-day events. So, at any rate, so we got the, the structure of the program. You team up somebody, a young scientist, young academic, with a freelance writer, editor, radio producer, filmmaker, whatever it happens to be, and try to mesh these things together. And I guess I can just say a little bit about the experience, because I think it was hard from both sides to do this. I think it was interesting to do teams, because it meant that you had, you pulled together the types of talent that you needed. But for someone who had been thinking about an article in a certain way, and had succeeded in publishing and writing about a subject in a certain way, all of a sudden they had to adjust their frame of reference and say, all right, we look at it and say, you've got all this material, we can use this, this, and this. The rest, we don't have space for. And it's hard to let go of that. I mean, that's the framework on which we build our conclusions. So they had to do that. And then the writers, on the other hand, were saying, well, I just want to tell a good story. I'm just going to engage it. This is such an interesting personality. This person over here was really, really good. But I said, that's right, but that story doesn't support the message that we're trying to deliver with this, because this is a policy magazine. These are social issues. You're working with people that do have something they want to see done. They want to see their expertise applied to a practical problem. They want to see policy made in the way they think it should be made. So they had to say, all right, you've got to give up this story that you want to tell, even though it is a great story and it would be the perfect lead. It's not the lead that's going to get us to tell the underlying story, the policy story that you want to tell, because you've got both wheels have to be turning and be in gear for this to succeed. So I was pleased that the authors, that the teams were willing to try this, and I know you've heard from some of them. I see Gwen is here in the audience, and I know, and some of the others. I looked at the program, so I don't know who made it here. Adam Briggle was, I think, was here earlier, and some of the others, maybe Ross Carper, and others were here. And I don't think it came easily for any of them. They all have read their H.L. Mencken. They know that writing is an easy job. You just sit down at a keyboard and open a vein. And they did, so they bled and they sweated and worked on this. Partially because they're trying to do something very new, and partially because they were doing it for a magazine, with an editor who wasn't used to doing this either. So it was different. I'd been at the Atlantic all along, and I had been editing these type of articles and dealing with that type of readership all along. Then I could have said, all right, I know what we're doing. But I'm also trying to educate a certain readership, the community of science policy wonks, the kind of that inner circle of people, to try and let them see that all of us should be trying to do more of this. That this isn't the only way to do it, that if you see a few examples of this, maybe it'll be easier for the next one to do it. Maybe there will be that scientist or engineer who's able to say, all right, I know how to do this. I'm as good as Atul Gawande, even though he was trained as a physician. Turns out he can tell a pretty good story. So I think that's what I was trying to do at the same time. I couldn't go too far away from my format. I couldn't go too far away from my audience, because they would look at it and they, and some of my colleagues at the Academy came up to me after I published the first one and said, what's this doing in your magazine? Where are the graphs? Where are the... I said, well, there aren't any graphs, what can I say? I said, well, who's going to read this? And I said, somebody other than the few hundred people that work in this building. I mean, that's what I hope. I hope a lot of people are going to read this. So I see this as an opportunity for me to increase the readership of my magazine by getting people like you who are willing to take a chance, who are willing to try to do something different, to expand what we do and expand the type of policy analysis that we've been doing for a long time and to make it something better. So that's really as much as I have to say, and I'm well within my 10 minutes, but I'm old and I'd run out of breath if I went any longer.
How many of you know Health Affairs? Could you raise your hands? That's a good smattering. Great. Health Affairs is even wonkier.
Try you have footnotes.
We have footnotes, yeah. Actually, we have endnotes. They're Vancouver style. Health Affairs is geared to policymakers. And it's a very inside the Beltway kind of publication. And it's to let policymakers know what's going on. There are a lot of heavy-duty research articles. There are charts. All of this. And then about 13 years ago, a new section was started. And this is when John Iglehart, who was the founder, was the editor, and he had an adult son die. And he realized that what he and his family were going through was not in his own journal. So he and a fellow named Fitzhugh Mullen, who you may know, who was a doctor, got together and started the Narrative Matters section and got funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to do this. And it is the storytelling section of Health Affairs. At this point, it even looks different. The paper has a slight tint to it, so the paper stock is different. We have illustrations as opposed to any photographs or charts. And there's a wonderful young illustrator in Britain who does them. And what I like, his name's Brett Ryder. And I send him an early draft, and he reads it. I mean, he's a great illustrator. He looks at the text, he reads it, and he comes up with an illustration. But we also treat it very much as if it's a part of Health Affairs. Health Affairs is peer-reviewed. We have 3 peer reviewers for our narratives, which is one more than the rest of the journal, because we want to make sure, in addition to all the subject matter experts, we have literary experts. And by this point, 13 years in, we have writers who are experts and have written for us too. So we often get a twofer. It's a wonderful group. It's a wonderful section of the journal. And we know that Health Affairs goes out in a lot of places besides policymakers. So the other thing I should add about policymakers is the person you're really trying to get to is the congressman or senator's aide. Because that is the person, say a 25-year-old person with a PhD in political science, who's going to be the first reader. They have to understand what you're saying. Or, as they say in this town, it'll never get to their member, meaning member of Congress. So you have to get it to their member. So you need to really write. I'll tell you this, it's DC, what can I say? We have fun with it. You should hear what certain congressmen's wives say when they get going at cocktail parties. But you have to make it understandable to get past that first thing. And if it's too dense, the person's going to spend a long time and is probably going to put it aside. But what our stories are doing is telling a health-related story that has some policy aspect to it. And that can be very subtle. I mean, it's the kind of thing you read a story, and then you say, somebody should do something about that. And it's like, bingo. What? And then it's like, you're the person who can do something about it. So as we go about it in that way, we want people to think about it. And We think of our readers as having the moral imagination to come up and start coming up with solutions. We want them to think outside the box in solutions as opposed to, you need to do X. So start thinking, what could we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Or how can we enlarge this idea to see that it does happen again? Health Affairs also goes to medical students. We do podcasts of Narrative Matters, so they can be assigned. They're on iTunes U. Goes to places like NIH. Pharmaceutical companies have one corporate subscription. At one point, we had one subscription for every university in China, which is now being broken down. It's very hard to say what our subscription is when China is one subscription. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you is how we approach language going into the Narrative Matters section. And I know everybody is telling you, and it's so true, not to be overly academic or use jargon or academic jargon. But I just would like to try and remind you how specific that is. For instance, we don't talk about renal failure. Somebody has kidney failure. It's like, it's even so many things you need to go over 2 to 3 times and go, is this really the clearest, most conversational way to say it? And the more you massage the copy, the clearer, the better, the tighter it will get. And as you're looking at the material you want to get across, and that of course is the essential part of the work you'll be doing, keep parsing it, keep breaking it down, keep translating it. At the same time, while you're doing this kind of very tight parsing and translating, remember to pull back. You have to start the story big enough, or at some point make it big enough that people know what you're talking about. And the more experienced you are, the more of an expert you are, the easier it is to start too far into the story. And you often have to take 2 steps backward to place it for people. And it varies from story to story from what that is. But you have to say, where are we? Who's going to pick this up? Will they know where we are? And the thing is, you know and they don't. So what I often tell our writers is, you're having dinner with friends, or with a family member you're fond of, and that they are not in your field. And you really want to tell them what you're doing, or who you met, or what's going on. So you have to keep breaking it down and breaking it down till it's that understandable. And that's not dumbing it down. It's not. It's making it clear. And all the best writers, all the best science writers, you pick it up, you read it. First read. Got it. And that's what you're doing. You're getting the smooth massage and massage to the first read is something that sticks with people. Now the second point is another DC point. Somewhat indelicate. I can tell you this. There's something in DC called asshole handles when you're writing. And everybody will make this mistake. God knows I have. So it's when you're writing a story or a report or something that's going to be a press release or a story about a program you're involved with that your boss is going to see. There needs to be somebody who reads behind you, who you trust, to make sure there's not that one word, that one sentence, that one phrase that an asshole can grab hold of and tilt the whole story. It's the report that goes out and it's like, what is this? And then the whole report is lost. It's the one sentence people hang on to and misuse. And this, given the kind of work you're going to do, it's like, just think of all the different people who are going to read it. We're not trying to offend someone, we're trying to make the point. Just make sure you're safe. This will help you. And then, this may sound minor, but as you go about this and as you're working on with colleagues and trying to put something together in a whole new way, I'd like to really argue for working cooperatively and a kind of civility from the first start. Right now, everybody's very enthusiastic. But using words like please, like thank you, like saying, it seems to me that you're saying, and remember to talk on the phone occasionally, not just email, because email can just get too terse. You don't know what's a joke and what's mean. But this is, something you're doing is very brave and very bold, but it's going to have some pitfalls. And if you just start out with that in mind, it'll go better. So I wish you all the best. This is going to be very fun. So thank you all.
Good evening, afternoon, whatever it is. Thank you for coming. My name is Mike Rosenwald. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post. I've been here in DC at the Post for about 8 years. I'm on the enterprise team. The Post, I tend to write a lot when it comes to science and technology. It's mostly consumer technology, this thing here that makes us ignore our children and drive into trees. My colleague Brian Bastek is here. He's our primary science writer these days, and does a much better job of it than I would do. I do a lot of science and medical writing for magazines like Esquire, Popular Science, Smithsonian, Discover, New Yorker, GQ, some magazines that you've probably seen at the dentist office. And I got into it about 10 or 12 years ago when there was a really strong desire for a lot of these more general interest consumer magazines, putting aside Popular Science, to do more science writing. And it was unusual for me and for anybody who knows me because I don't know anything about science. I did very poorly in science in every academic level I ever achieved. But I was incredibly interested in science because of its inherent mystery, curiosity, and character. And so I started to writing more about science. And in terms of, and I know a lot of you think about policy and science and all these things, and I was thinking about this the last few days. I approach science writing almost primarily for the story, and then look for the issue upon which to project that story to. Sometimes it works in reverse, so I'll give you a couple different examples. One example is about 15 years ago, there was a lot of discussion in cities about the dramatic drop in homicides in urban areas. And politicians, police chiefs, governors were all taking a lot of credit for this. The mayor of Baltimore was Martin O'Malley, who's now the governor of Maryland. They had a precipitous drop in homicides in Baltimore, a city where they used to keep track in the newspaper. They had a number count in the newspaper of how many people had been killed that day. But things had declined. And I was living in Boston. I was working at the Boston Globe covering police. I was just a standard police reporter, and was looking for interesting stories, and came across this journal called Homicide Studies that had a fascinating study in there about the fact that we were shooting more people with more powerful weapons, but less people were dying. And this researcher, this criminologist, had done just remarkable statistical work and research. And he had carefully plotted out how the decline in homicides had more or less correlated with a second and third generation of trauma surgeons who'd been trained by people in Vietnam, and a number of different technologies that were working their way into emergency rooms. And so this was just utterly fascinating to me. And I had a rather unimaginative editor at the time who said, yeah, it's a study, blah, blah, read it up. But I was just really obsessed with this because I just thought it was just really incredible. And so I called an editor, a friend of mine at Popular Science, and said, you know, we got to write about this. And we got to figure out a way to do it. And the way I wanted to do it, the way I ultimately did it, was to find a city that had a really high murder rate and a really significant decline that also happened to have a pretty good emergency room. It turned out Baltimore was, you know, it's like murder capital of the East Coast. They had the first standalone trauma center in the world, shock trauma. And I just basically moved in there for a month with a photographer, slept there, ate there, wore scrubs. I mean, it got to the point where I'd be sleeping in the kitchen room on the floor when it was quiet, and you know, somebody would wake me up and say, "Hey, can you help me roll this body?" Like they thought I worked there. You know, like, can you help us get this body? And I was just, you know, and so that's what I did. And I lived there, and I found a patient and followed this patient, followed a patient, and told the story of a patient who probably would have died 10 years ago, but didn't, due to the person who was treating him, the technology he was using to treat him, the meds that they were giving him, the scans they were, I mean, everything, and told the story about a policy. Tried to get inside a policy or inside a policy debate through sort of an end-around way and explain that your governor, city officials, and all these other people were probably not actually responsible for the crime drop in your neighborhood. And so that's one example. Another example is starting off with the policy implications and finding the story that goes with it. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I don't know, maybe it's less than that, we were all going to die from bird flu, as you may have recalled. And the world was, you know, freaking out. People were stocking, what's the name of that drug? Oh, yeah. Tamiflu, right. Yeah, people were like stealing it, like ordering it from China. It was like crazy. And I wanted to write about this, and I went to my editor at Smithsonian Magazine and said, we should find a really good story. There's there's got to be something cool here. And I decided that I wanted to profile this guy named Robert Webster, who was a researcher at St. Jude Medical Center in Memphis, and is sort of the godfather of bird flu, and was one of the guys who figured out how it goes from birds to ducks and all this stuff, pigs and everything. And of course, he was a very popular person at that moment, and everybody was calling him for quotes and all this sort of stuff. And so when I called him and his people up, and I said, look, I don't want to quote on X, Y, or Z. I want to write about your life at this moment. You know, this moment is fascinating for you. This is like the best thing in your life to ever happen to you, and the worst thing, right? I mean, you know, he never wanted to see this day, but he was born for this day. And so, and he was going around the world trying to get policy people to actually take this issue seriously, because at the time, you know, it was more kind of a hypochondriac thing, and then it was like, which was my approach to it, because I'm a hypochondriac. But governments and local governments, nobody's really paying attention to it. So he didn't really understand why like a magazine would like want to profile him. This went on for like a few weeks. Like he really didn't get it, and I totally understood it. And by that time I had read up a lot about him and seen various awards and watched his speeches. And I said, look, I just want to come with you to a conference. I want to see you speak. I want to come to your house in Memphis. And he was really obsessed. He has a corn party. He's obsessed with corn, and he orders this genetically modified corn that's incredibly sweet. And every year in the summer, in July, he has a corn party at his house where people just walk around eating corn and they dip it in butter, and it's the only thing you can eat is corn. So I said, I want to come to your corn party. And he just didn't really understand. Why would you want to come to my corn party? It has nothing to do with bird flu. Well, it kind of does. So ultimately I said to him, look, I said, if you've ever seen a documentary movie, think of that, and that's what I want to do with your life. And I want people to understand what your life is like at this incredible moment, this once in a lifetime moment. And so that's a standard line that I use to get people to understand what I'm doing. The other standard line that I use is when people don't want to talk to me is I say, look, if I won't be insulted if you don't like me, you tell me to leave. I said, I've never had that happen before, but come let me be a fly on the wall. And really, if you, your wife, you don't like me, I will leave, right? I will absolutely leave. I will not be insulted. I won't write the story. And it worked. And so I ended up spending just an incredible amount of time with this guy. He was incredibly sweet, and wrote that story. So those are two different sort of examples. But in terms of magazines, general interest magazines, the last thing I'll say here is there's incredible need and hunger for these kinds of stories, and not lots of people who do them well. And it's if you can cross the barrier with a lot of these magazines, the appetite is endless for science stories, because they have almost everything that good stories have. In fact, they almost always do, which is a mystery. And readers love stories that have some sort of mystery, and magazines love stories that people will read from beginning to end. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, I want to tell you right away that if you don't like me, I'll leave. Just tell me, yeah. I want to pass out a copy, since Issues in Science and Technology got a chance to scope the room. Creative nonfiction. So, this is really important to me, this program, in many ways. And I'm going to step back a little bit and explain for those of you who don't know that clearly that more than 200 people from all across the world wrote essays and applied to this program. And the whole idea behind this program is to bring together science policy scholars, next generation science policy scholars with next generation emerging writers who are interested in nonfiction, and not necessarily interested, or in narrative nonfiction, and not necessarily interested in science, not necessarily at all, but in fact, or engineering, but in fact we want to take this a little bit, make this a little bit harder, a little bit more challenging, make it really, really difficult to do. Science is hard to achieve in narrative, even though Mike is absolutely right, science is a great mystery, but we want to go one step more, and we want to deal with the ideas behind science. We want to deal with science and innovation policy, and we want to deal with through narrative, and we want to deal with how the world, how we as writers can talk to, and as scholars can work together to talk, to foresee the future of technology, the future of science, the future of this planet and all the people who live on this planet. And so to me that's incredibly challenging. We had these 200 people, and in this room there are the 24 people that have been selected, plus lots of other visitors and guests, and we've been here together for 3 or 4 days, and we'll be here for another day or two. So that's the program. And here I am in the middle. I'm the man in the middle in many respects. I started the first MFA program in creative nonfiction in the world. I started the Creative Nonfiction magazine, the first magazine or literary journal that published narrative nonfiction exclusively, and now it's still the largest by far. And our circulation also goes all around the world. But I left a writing program that I helped start, and I moved in with a bunch of wonks. I mean, I moved in to a science policy think tank. Okay, here I am, a writer, a creative writer, now hanging around with a bunch of people who all they do is think and talk about things that I simply often don't understand. I'm joking, but it's a really interesting, really fascinating world transition for me. And as I look at this world of narrative, of creative nonfiction, which I helped begin to pioneer and move forward, as I look at it, I see this wave that's occurring. something really important is happening. That first of all, creative nonfiction is the fastest growing genre in the publishing industry. Creative nonfiction is the fastest growing genre in the academic community. I started the first MFA program. Well, I don't know if this is true, but someone told me yesterday that there are 27 places in the United States of America that you can get a PhD in creative nonfiction. I don't know why you would want a PhD in creative nonfiction, but okay. Okay, so it has really spread. And here's what's happening. We're moving into other areas. People are understanding that narrative, that story, communicates information and ideas in a much more effective way than straight exposition, and than straight journalism that many newspapers and magazines still practice. People remember facts longer when those facts are presented in a story. People remember more facts. People are persuaded more easily when the information and the ideas are presented in a story. All of this happens in this world of narrative. And so now there's this subgenre called narrative medicine. And in many medical schools all across the United States, you can, young doctors, young nurses, new nurses can take narrative medicine courses, not just to learn to write, but even more importantly because the writer learns that the way in which you get your story, is to listen carefully to the people you're interviewing. And the young doctor the young doctor needs to do something really significant, it's to learn how to listen to his or her patients, because most people will tell you that 80% of diagnosis has everything to do with listening to and understanding the patient's story. Narrative law, there are guys like me and Mike and others who are going into law schools and teaching attorneys how to write narratives so that they can communicate and eliminate jargon and tell a story that's going to not only persuade a jury, but also persuade a judge. There are even people like me who are teaching judges more how to communicate back to their own constituency. Medicine, narrative has always been involved in sports. This is a new wave. This is incredibly exciting to me because creative nonfiction started in writing programs and in English departments, and now we're talking about how do we communicate through narrative the ideas of science and innovation policy. Ideas, sometimes ideas that haven't occurred yet. How are we going to do that through narrative? Okay? So that's the challenge, and that's the wave. And that to me is incredibly exciting, and that's why, frankly, we have this program, which has been funded by the National Science Foundation. And just a couple more things. I'm making this transition, but dragging my colleagues in writing and in journalism with me is not easy, okay? Because the culture is so different. As Kevin mentioned before, we writers don't want to communicate in charts, okay? We don't do that, and we don't understand charts. And so that's one thing, but more than anything else, writers in writing programs, I gotta tell you, there are too many writing programs in the United States. There are, if there are 27 places that you can get a PhD in creative nonfiction, well, believe me, there must be 500 creative writing programs around the country. Some of them, many of them work real hard and they do real well. But there are many, and it's really cool that people want to write and learn how to write better. That's wonderful. But I would like to see the writing program people making the transition into these other worlds. I'd like to see, and I'm hoping that this is the way in which we begin, I'd like to see people in writing programs also having to major in and learn about something else other than writing, so that we have something to say. Well, what happens in writing programs so often, especially in nonfiction writing programs, is that the 21-year-olds and the 22-year-olds write a memoir, okay? And so we have a big joke. There's always a big joke when the faculty gets together and you say, well, how many dead grandmother stories did you get this week? Because what else happens to a 20-year-old if the grandmother dies? Well, we're sad. My grandmother died too. It was awful. but let's do it. So we have narrative. We have narrative, we have story, we have something that we know that has worked since the beginning of civilization. And we know it works well. And the research is really phenomenal. There's been great narrative research that has been taking place over the past decade to show that narrative sells, that narrative communicates, that narrative impacts, that story is the way to communicate information that people don't necessarily want to know. But it's a story they always want to know. So this is what's happening to me in what's happening in the world and why we're here. We're here to make the jump. Maybe it's not going to be a big jump, and maybe it's not going to be a fast jump. Maybe it's going to be a really slow transition. But I'm hoping that writers and journalists, because in journalism we still don't study most long-form narrative journalism, okay? We still don't do that. Now we're studying blogs. This is what we're doing. We're learning how to write things in 140 words, not 14,000 words. This is what I'd like to see happen, and this is what I'm hoping this program will do, and I'm hoping that we all see that we can communicate what we know here around the Beltway. We can connect to a member easily if we do it through story. We make the transition. And that's kind of what we hope at CSPO and at Arizona State and at Creative Nonfiction Magazine, that we can gradually get editors, publishers, academics, and creative writers, poets, playwrights, fiction writers, and nonfiction writers to come together, to work together. It will be our mission to communicate lots and lots of important information about science, technology, and about policy, about how we're going to shape the future to the general public through story. That, to me, is the role of what we're doing here and what we all ought to be really engaged with and how we're going to make an impact on the world in the next 10 years.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Kevin and Ellen and Mike and Lee. And now, your folks' job. Let's get some discussion going, hopefully as robust as what was going on beforehand.
Can I just add one thing to what Lee said?
Oh, please.
In terms of Washington and policy and story, two things came to mind as we were talking. One was that the 9/11 report was written in a narrative way. Most primarily for what, I don't want to give you too much credit, but in terms of getting people to remember, you know. And the Starr report about the Clinton-Lewinsky thing was also written in a narrative way, and many people at the time said that it had to be written that way in order for it to be more convincing and whatnot. But I remember reading both of those reports and thinking that was just fascinating that had that approach.
Those are excellent symbols. Okay, so I'd like to invite people to raise their hands, offer some comments and questions to our panel. Please introduce yourselves, because we're a relatively small group, and there are some of all of our fellows and mentors and participants in our To Think to Write program, but roughly equal number of folks from around the community. And part of the goal of this meeting is to have you meet each other, so it'd be nice if you introduce yourselves before you offer your comment or question. Oh, please. Rachel.
You may be surprised at this question. So Rachel Levinson from Arizona State University. I have a question for Michael, and I apologize for it in advance. Have you ever written a profile of Craig Venter in which he is naked, either on a boat, on a beach, somewhere, and if so, why is that a necessary and compelling part of what I see as every profile I've ever seen of Craig Venter?
I've never seen Craig Venter naked.
I never read this.
I've read what you're talking about. I didn't write it. I've spoken to Craig Venter both in his office not far from here in Rockville. He was dressed. I have spoken to him on the phone from one of his boats. I don't know if he was dressed, I didn't ask. That was sort of inappropriate. I also didn't want to tell him what I was wearing. It's part of, now, having said all that, to somewhat defend possibly the idea of writing about Craig Venter naked, we as journalists tend to write about people as we see them. We prefer them clothed, I mean, for the most, I mean, there are examples, I won't get into it, but Craig Venter is a character, he is a larger-than-life individual. He is a scientist who not only is he brilliant, but he's eccentric, is I guess the word I would use. He's a big personality, you know. I mean, there are parties that are thrown in Washington, and you know, he has lots of enemies, and people, you know, you have to have them in separate rooms, and so he's a big personality. I know what you're talking. I've read the thing that you're talking about. As a reader, I don't have too much of a problem with it if it's within his character, and if I as a reporter, if I thought he was doing it only to purposely be eccentric, right? To as an act. Well, I'd try to approach it from a position of writing about it as an act. But from what I remember reading, I mean, he kind of just likes to be out there.
I mean, out.
Yeah, I mean, really, yeah. But like I said earlier, I think we write about people as we see them, and if this is part of who his character is, or who he thinks his character is, I think it's important to deal with that, because his personality, or any scientist's personality, invariably has an effect on their work and their relationship with the people they work with, compete with, get money from. And during that whole genome, sequencing thing in this town, I mean, it was the personality differences between him and Collins were just dramatic, right? I mean, and it had a lot to do with the fact of why they didn't get along. These were two completely different people competing against each other to do something that nobody had ever done before in a very public way. And ultimately they had to sort of be brought together like in a peace deal almost. So that characteristic of him, I think, is important to describe if you're relating it to his work and how he approaches his life.
Yes, Adam.
I'll stand up because I can't see you guys. My name is Adam Briggle. I'm a mentor for this round. I was involved in the first round as well. My question is, anybody could snap at it, but it's in the research evaluation frame of mind. So the program is partly justified on the basis of the virtues of narrative for getting people to remember facts, more facts, maybe even to impact policy. And I'm wondering, do you have any evidence yet that it's having the impacts that we might want to see? And it may be too early, right, because we've only done so much. If it is too early, what kind of evidence or metrics or indicators would you look at for success, given our mission with this program? It may be primarily for you, me, actually, but I don't know.
You're asking me just about the program. And I guess...
What about the publications, I think?
Well, we've had Kevin has published 5 of we've had 12 teams. Kevin has published 5 of those teams, including teams, collaborators, writers, and scholars. You were one of those people that Kevin published. There have been another half-dozen publications of one sort or another from these 12 people, or websites or web magazines started. And more important than anything else is that this is round 2, and where we have received a much more substantial support from the National Science Foundation than before. So I think, on the one hand, this sounds old. It's not that great. 2 people working together. But on the other hand, to write one article or one essay. But on the other hand, it really is in many respects something really new and different that I mean, think about cooperation, working together, collaboration. This doesn't happen that often, and especially from two different cultures. So we're moving forward, and we've made that kind of movement by making this happen again in a much larger scale. I might ask Kevin if he wants to say any more about his readership. He has, what, Kevin, about 10,000 readers, and if you've received responses.
I haven't, and one of the frustrations of being a magazine editor is that if you do things right, you don't hear right away. People don't call, they just pat you on the back. I'll tell a story about an article we published and an article we didn't publish, and the difference it made. Elliot Fisher is a researcher at Dartmouth who has done all of the research that has uncovered how much healthcare costs vary from place to place, and not just between Johns Hopkins and some local clinic in Oklahoma, but even among the top research places and even from town to town. Anyway, terrific data. He published it with us. It was really compelling, really useful. We probably got one or two letters to the editor. Luckily, one of the people that read Fisher's work was Atul Gawande. He wrote a piece in the New Yorker that talked about two towns in Texas and how different they were. And he told the stories of people going to get care and not being able to afford it, or the bills that they were getting for the very same procedures. He was invited to the White House, and the data that Elliot Fisher collected and wrote about in issues, because it was translated through Gawande's storytelling skills, became an important ingredient in the structure of Obamacare, and is still, a major component of the debate in healthcare now, because people have come to understand that there's a sort of irrational economic structure and pricing system in healthcare. We knew that before. Those of us, everybody at Health Affairs knew that. Elliot Fisher probably published a scholarly article in Health Affairs first, then published a somewhat more accessible article in Issues, but then it was only when Gawande picked it up and put it in the New Yorker that it really made a difference.
Yes, and I'll add to that too. We know that Narrative Matters is the most popular section of Health Affairs. It's always in the top 50 hits on our website each month, and often that's like at least 3 of them. It's often the top read each month. We've actually had one that was the top read for 2 months in a row, the same one. And this is where it gets squishy, but it's real. I mean, Atul Gawande's real, but what do you attach to that? But you know it's a fact. We've had Kathleen Sebelius give a speech where she takes a recent Narrative Matters and retells the story of that guy to an audience. That's huge. We also get picked up by the Washington Post often, so then you go to all the Post readers. Sometimes it goes out on the wire service. Sometimes National Public Radio will pick up the author and excerpts a section as a commentary. And I would add too, I think if you just listen to NPR, you'll hear a beautiful job of translation and getting rid of jargon, and how they'll sometimes do a lead-in to say what something means that somebody's about to say. But I just think it's huge. People like stories. People read stories. And if it, as somebody once said, if it touches their hearts, it's already touched their minds.
I'd like to add just one more example, and that is if the proposal for this iteration of To Think, to Write, to Publish starts out with a paragraph that captures a book, a best-selling book on the New York Times. It's from Dave, best-selling book on the New York Times bestseller list about science policy. How can that be? But in fact, there is a book that has been on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 2 years, written by a creative nonfiction writer in creative nonfiction style, that is all about science policy. It's probably been republished now in 20 languages. It's probably, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of copies. It's sold. It's called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, and it's a science policy story narrative with the narrator alive, right there, telling the story along with the characters involved from both the medical and the personal side. It's a very exciting book. It's a very, a very successful and compelling book.
Just one other thing, there are also certain stories, including policy stories, that have to be told in narrative. They can't be told the analytic way. For 25 years, I've been working on the very simple question about how do you justify federal investments in research and development. And we've created all sorts of economic models and analysis of return on investment and everything. And I just came from a meeting with the head of the UK's university research organization. And we're throwing our hands up because we realized that that story can't be told with numbers and economic analysis. That the way innovation works, the way we develop products, the way science develops and the way it's used is a part of a sort of complex ecosystem of innovation that works in very different ways and follows different paths, and you can't reduce it to simple charts, tables, and graphs and so on. And we're come to a point where we're going to be fighting for the life of research funding, and the analysis that we've been trying to do all these years is not going to win the fight. It's not going to win the battle. What is going to win the battle is if someone is able to tell the story of this rich, exciting adventure of research, innovation, to product, to process, to environmental improvement, to better public health, and all of that. And there are plenty of stories out there that have to be told, and they're the only things that are going to succeed. We don't have an analytic framework that'll give you conclusive proof. It just isn't there.
Here before Michael, please.
My name is Michael Kors. I'm a freelance writer. I've written some stories from Wired. I've written 2 books on neuroscience. So the question I would like to put to you is, how do you find the story when you can't seem to find the story? For example, I'm very interested in search for extraterrestrial intelligence. I find it an incredibly interesting topic. I've read every book out there about it. But whenever I try to pitch a place like Wired, for example, they say, what's the story? And I'm really stumped, because as fascinating as the subject is to me, I can't seem to find that story. Now maybe one reason is because it hasn't happened yet.
No, I know the answer.
But still, how can something that's so interesting to you be so hard to write about it as a story?
Virginia.
Virginia has the answer.
I know the answer to that. You need to find a scientist who's a good character, and that's the story. You find a scientist, you have a character, you have a story. You go with them somewhere. Maybe, there's places like Mont Lake and California, Nevada, where there's sort of landscape, something like they think on some of the other planets. So you go with them somewhere, but you want a good character, and then you've got a story.
I've thought about that. And there certainly are characters in the field. And I'm not sure if character automatically gives you narrative. That's what
It should. If you go with the person and they're doing the research, it should. I'll talk about this tomorrow. I'll give you an example of going to meet this ant researcher who discovered that ants teach. And anyway, I'll give an example tomorrow. But yeah, what you want is to find a good character. Then you should have a story. You should have characters, scene. It should, and the subject is interesting. So that kind of is the recipe. To me,
Thank you. Well, let's turn it over to the panel.
I would totally agree with that. The person speaking back there was Virginia Morel, who's a wonderful writer for many publications, including National Geographic, and has incredible ability to go on the best trips ever. It's true. Sometimes if you're like trying to decide between 2 characters and where you're going to go, I sometimes think, well, I've never been to this one place before going there. And that's not a lie. As a writer, when you're looking for to tell a story, if you were reading a great novel and it didn't have a great character, you wouldn't keep turning the pages. So, in the same for the kind of same applies to the kind of writing we're trying to do and talk about here. You've got, my approach has always been to find 3 or 4 sort of, I call them candidates, and I try to sort of pre-interview them, talk to them, get a sense of what their schedule is, and then I sort of sit down and look at what's going to work, and both in terms of practicality, in terms of timing, and when the magazine wants a story, whatever, but also in terms of what they're doing. Sometimes it doesn't work out with people. You don't get along with them. You don't think that you're going to be able to get the kind of access that you need, and you need to move on to somebody else. In certain circumstances, the right person might not be anyone but you. I've used myself several times. When personalized medicine was starting to get very interesting, there were lots of stories being done about it. I was interested in writing about it from the patient perspective and what it was like to go through something, and a couple of things had fallen through, so I just said, well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to take all these DNA tests. I'm going to go get this full body physical at Greenbrier Clinic. I'm going to have my wife swab my mouth with DNA thing. It was very romantic. And so I've used myself sometimes when I can't find anyone better. But you've got to read widely on the topic you're looking for. I read deep into footnotes and endnotes. There's sometimes an occasional anecdote there somewhere that may jump out. But cast a wide net and you'll find it.
Yeah, it's a question for Ellen and Kevin.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, I'm Brian Bastick at the Washington Post, and when I grew up, I wanted to be on my brother.
Oh, yeah, right. Brian, did you do the NIH Superbug thing?
Yes.
Speaking of policy and telling a story, as journalists at the Washington Post, we try not to, overtly try to, change someone's opinion, right? But we only covertly. But no, we whenever we can, try to tell a story about an important event, and those stories, in particular on policy, or things that need to change, or things that the government needs to grapple with. And those stories tend to just fly, and if they're about science, they really fly. And Brian has been covering this superbug story at the NIH that was just wreaking havoc on people, and he wrote it in a very mysterious, narrative kind of way, and the story just went insane on our website, and in the I assume in the paper product, but that's Brian.
That actually up a good point. That as a comment, these stories they do well on other newspaper websites as well. The New York Times, the most read, most emailed stories are often science narrative or science mystery type stories. People love to read them, and it gives me job security. At least I hope it does. But the question I had was, writers are always looking to augment income, and there's a lot of writers. So how do you two find writers to match with your, more policy oriented folks? Is it just kind of people you know and networks, or how do you make that happen?
I shouldn't say this in a room full of writers. We don't pay.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we really have no budget at all to pay for writers, which is one of the difficulties, one of the reasons it's hard to get well-written articles. I'm dependent on people, programs like this, that support people and encourage them, and gives them the time to do some writing.
I would say that would be a major obstacle.
Yeah, so I wind up with people whose job is to promote policy or in the policy business, and that's what they do, but they're not writers. And so I'm taking contributions, but it's hard. I mean, it's one of the reasons we haven't done it more.
We, I'm afraid, don't pay either. We did at one point, but that's where budget constraints have come in. We get people sending them in. I mean, that's one virtue of doing something for 13 years. We do get one type that once in a while works, usually doesn't. A young medical student story in some way. We get an awful lot of the first time I saw X. And that's, to people who've seen this hundreds of times, isn't going to work. But we just get, the best ones come just word of mouth. Somebody who's written before suggests that somebody else does it. People, some of them are readers. I went to Johns Hopkins for a writing program recently, went back to school, and I have to say I pulled in a number of my classmates. And it's worked well. When they get picked up by other people, they get paid.
Creative nonfiction, a little measly, small literary magazine, pays. We don't pay very much, but we pay. And we also offer very often cash prizes, large prizes, for the best essay of one on different subjects. But I want to say that once again, this kind of shows the difference in the cultures between the writing world and the journalism academic world, because to a writer, not that journalists aren't writers, but to a writer, publication, being presented in a publication that they can be proud of, getting their work in print and getting it printed or presented without being cut in half by a newspaper editor, that's really a reward in itself. And so writers need that and want that. And many times in the writing world, Kevin may not pay, but if you're in the writing world and you write a really terrific, in this case, narrative piece, and you're published in Kevin's magazine or in our magazine, Creative Nonfiction, that could lead to a job. I mean, it's that important. So there are other rewards other than just money. And I want to say one more thing about the crossing of cultures. Mike has written for the New Yorker and Esquire and Smithsonian, and I won't ask him how many millions of dollars he's made, but he's made some bucks, okay? We know that, and so again,
Why am I here?
you're here because you love me, Mike. But otherwise, but he's made some money, okay? And we can't, and this is the other thing that I know I harp on, this connecting of cultures. But with all these writing programs, I want to guarantee you there are not a lot of full-time jobs for people with degrees in poetry. Okay? There aren't poetry and residence jobs everywhere. It's very hard to get a job with a poetry degree. You got to end up doing something else. Okay? And so the world of nonfiction does pay money more than poetry pays money, and often more than fiction pays money. And so the other reason to kind of connect the cultures is some of the best poets in the world write terrific creative nonfiction, Diane Ackerman being one of them, Terry Tempest Williams being somebody else. So this is another reason. Poets can write poetry like Diane still does and make a fortune at the same time. So there's publication, and then there's this opportunity to write poetry and then do something else besides that.
And if I could add just one thing, the reason people write for us, it's specifically what our journal is. You know, our writers will get a call and be asked to testify before Congress. That's happened. We've had letters written to us by